Hi there, Janos,
Yeah,
and
keep.
hello, all of our other attendees and folks who are joining. My name is Dr. GP Laborde, and I'm the head of partnerships at Polygens. I am just delighted to welcome you here to our special panel, How to Wow Your College Admissions Officers. We love when students have really pure learning and exploratory experiences while doing their Polygens projects, but we also know that this is really an amazing opportunity for many of them to basically build a narrative about who they are intellectually and who they want to become when they get to college. And so thinking about those applications and how you can tell that story through them is something that we're very sensitive to and that we want to learn more about, especially from the experts that we have in our counselor community. I'm going to introduce you to some of them right now. And really what I'd like to focus on through the course of this talk is the questions that you, students and parents, have about how to stand out in a sea of other qualified applicants when you apply to school. So this is especially helpful, of course, for those rising seniors who are thinking about gearing up for their applications. And I'm hoping, as we sort of discussed before opening the doors to the public, that we'll have some interesting questions that maybe we didn't anticipate as well. So please post your questions as soon as you have them in the Q&A, and we'll get to them after these brief introductions from our presenters. So I'll just introduce them all now. We have Ian Fisher of Bright Horizons College Coach, Purvi Modi from Insight Education, and William Chung of Zenith Prep Academy. Purvi, because you and I were speaking a little bit beforehand, can I invite you to go first, and then we'll move to Ian.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, and welcome to all of our students that are here. We're very excited to answer your questions. A little background about me. I am co-owner and head of college counseling for Insight Education. We are a college counseling firm based in the Bay Area with an office in Boston, and we work with a really wide range of kids across the world, across range of interests, across backgrounds. One of the big things that we talk about in our office is not just about applying to college, but preparing for life. And in that pursuit, we talk about what we call non-cognitive factors, which are things like creativity, initiative, perseverance, thinking about cultural backgrounds and different ideas and experiences, and really big supporters of lifelong learning. Life is not a straight and narrow path. It is very winding, and it tops and turns, and you really want to leave space for all spontaneity and exploration. And to that end, one of the things that we're big advocates for is lifelong learning, and really being able to explore your interests at a very deep level. Not only is it really important for your own development, but it is also really valuable for colleges to see that, because now you're able to stand out. You're not one of those students that just, again, follow that straight and narrow path, but you're someone who took risks. You took someone who dove deeply into a topic that might have been a little bit more obscure. So throughout our conversation, I'd love to be able to give some examples potentially to help you understand what that really means for you, and also for your short term applying to college, and then maybe your long term goals.
Great. That's awesome, Purvi. Thanks. My name is Ian Fisher. I'm a director with Bright Horizons College Coach. We are a coast-to-coast organization. We even have an office out in Hawaii. We are entirely former college admission officers from institutions all over the country. I myself worked at Reed College, which is a liberal arts college in Portland, Oregon. It's probably best known for being the place that Steve Jobs dropped out of. But if you have ever enjoyed a font that you've used on your computer, it is the direct impact of a Reed College calligraphy course that created fonts on the computers. And that's what Steve Jobs took when he was surfing on couches and taking classes at Reed. And what I love about that is it really shows his sense of curiosity, right? He was driven to learn something that was exciting to him. He didn't say calligraphy. What's the point of that? How am I ever going to use this? But when they were building the first Apple computers, they, of course, had those wonderful typefaces, which helped to differentiate Apple from the other computer makers at the time. And what I love about Polygens is it's this great opportunity for you to get to explore your interests and to explore that kind of curiosity that you have. I imagine you're all quite driven. It is a Saturday. want to acknowledge that and thank you all for being here on a Saturday, which is really cool. And I'm happy to engage with any questions that you have about how things work in the admission process. I've been with College Coach for coming up on 9 years now and have supported many students in addition to all of the applications that I reviewed as a part of the Reed College admission office. And I should also say, I studied philosophy when I was a student. So that informs a lot of the work that I do now in terms of being more interested in the questions than the answers, right? Like, let's see if we can have an interesting conversation and unpack some ideas together. And I love that that seems to be a big part of the research work that you all do with Polygens and beyond. So GP, I don't know if there's more that you wanted there, but hopefully that's a good place to start.
Absolutely, and that was wonderful. Janos is giving us some numbers to back up those observations about Drive. We have about 240 students who are with us this morning. So really so many people thinking about, how do I let my mind expand even in my spare time by attending these wonderful events? Okay, so I will kick off the questions for each of you, and then I think you should feel fairly free to let it take you to anecdotes, examples of specific students you've worked with, or specific visits, for example, you've had to college campuses where things reveal themselves to you. One of the first questions that I know that many students ask is the question between sort of angularity and well-roundedness. And I think that that's a tension that everyone really has to walk. How do you approach this questions for students, especially who are maybe looking for something that they're super passionate about, especially as a freshman or a sophomore? It might be challenging for some students to say, this is what I want to have be my thing, or this is the thing that I want to feature on my applications. How do you approach those conversations with students?
Yeah. So thank you, Ian. So, it's actually a really great question. I think students feel an incredible amount of pressure at much younger ages these days to feel like they have to declare their major or figure out what their passion is in life. It's a word that I've actually come to strongly despise these days.
Same. Yes.
Years ago, I loved it. And nowadays I feel like it's just way too much pressure, because even as an adult, we're constantly changing and evolving. And I think it's really important for kids to have the opportunity to explore. So I really encourage younger students, 9th and 10th graders especially, don't worry about becoming angular. Now, there are a subset of kids who are very driven, who are very focused on potentially a particular extracurricular or academic pursuit. But even for those kids, I tell them, still explore. You are too young in your life to have narrowed down to one particular pathway. And if you don't explore now, it's going to be much harder to do so as you get older, because you're just going to get deeper and deeper and deeper into this one potential pathway. And so really, I mean, I'll give an example. I had a student who, she was in 8th grade moving into 9th grade. And she thought for sure, she's like, I think I want to be a doctor. I'm like, it's way too early for you to know that, because you haven't done any science courses of, significance. And all you are able to tell me is that you want to be a doctor based on what you think the profession is like, but you haven't actually done any scientific research. Let's talk about your other interests. And so as she's diving into high school, she's taking her science courses, but she also really loves writing. And so one of her projects for Polygens has been actually developing a novel. And so she has been writing a science fiction novel for the past few months, just wrapping it up. And it's just been such a great experience for her. Now, is she switching all the way over to literature? Absolutely not. But this was an opportunity for her to explore an interest that was drastically different than what she thought she might be interested in, while also exploring her interest in science a bit more deeply. For older students, I think it's a little bit different. I do like them to dive into projects if they haven't had exposure to a field that they're particularly thinking about, I like them to get exposure to it. So sometimes a kid will come in and say, I want to do computer science. I'm like, but you've had no experience. Or I want to do chemistry. I'm like, okay, all you did was take a chemistry course. What else have you done? Or I want to study philosophy, right? Like Ian's talking about, most kids can't take philosophy in high school. And so it's really an opportunity for them to do something more deeply into what they're actually interested in, explore the field, which is not just for colleges. People often say, oh, this will help you on my college applications. I'm like, yeah, it definitely will. But more importantly, it's helping you explore your interest to see if it's something you want to follow, something you're actually really excited about, not passionate, excited about.
Right. Right. I think if you're asking that question, what can I do to help my college applications? You've already asked the wrong question. Right. And what you want to be thinking about is, what can I explore that I might be excited by, that'll help me to cultivate an interest or develop a talent? And the byproduct of that will be really great contributions to your college application. But you don't want to assume, all right, I got to get here. How do I get there? I think it's the path that can tend to be much more interesting. There's a lot of pressure around almost having answers for these questions. What do you want to study? What's your passion? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? And that comes from conversations with aunts and uncles. They know you're getting ready to go to college. And so they'll ask you these questions. And I think it can be hard to kind of resist those ideas. Instead of passion, I like to think about encouraging students to follow that sense of curiosity or to develop those interests and see where they take them. To your point, GP, some students are just well-rounded. Like, that's just who they are. And I think it's great for them to lean into that, to want to be involved in lots of different things. And some students have really sharp areas of focus where they want to explore really deeply. There's a great book. I think I want to say it's The Talent Code, and it's about, I'm thinking of Range. Sorry, different book. So there's this book on Range, which is basically about how you explore different kinds of talents that you have. And the author contrasts Tiger Woods, who basically played golf from the time that he was 2 years old and only did golf and was obviously excellent in it, with Roger Federer, who didn't start to specialize in tennis until he was about 14 or 15 years old. He played all of the other sports along the way. And so both of these athletes got to the very top of their field, but by having totally different approaches to how they were going to do that. And I think the same thing is true when it comes time to explore your high school interests. Try lots of stuff, see what you like, and don't be discouraged if you haven't found that one thing just yet. There will be time for that to still be explored. And in my very first year working as a counselor, I had a student who was considering animal science or digital media, which are two very different things, right? And she did a summer course in Stanford on digital design. And then she spent about 3 weeks volunteering at a horse hospital. And after those two experiences, she said, I'm going to do animal science. She's just like, I know that this is what I want. I loved it. I didn't understand why she loved it, but she did, right? And she ended up applying early decision for the animal science program at Cornell and getting in. And it was because she could articulate that interest that she had in her application and through her application that it was such a strong contribution to that applicant pool. So know yourself, but understand that the knowledge of self will, I think, evolve as time goes on.
Thanks so much to both of you for these anecdotes. I really think those kinds of stories, especially both with maybe students who are anonymous, but we can recognize versions of ourself in Purvey, and also those famous people, Ian, who we sort of hold up on these pedestals, tracking their own paths to where they've arrived can be really helpful and inspiring for students as they begin to set out on their own journeys. So we are at a very strange stage in history. We were just applauding all of our seniors who are getting their news about applications back, because what a time to be in high school, or really in any school, certainly in any profession. And I know it's been really hard for so many students to go out and actually visit the schools that they would have otherwise wanted to see in person before putting on their lists or making commitments to. What sort of advice do you have for students who are in these situations now? Things are looking hopeful from a public health perspective that maybe college visits will resume more or less normally as they were before this summer. But in terms of building those lists sort of sight unseen, or maybe getting around those obstacles of sight unseen, how are you encouraging your students to get to know colleges and to build lists that really connect with who they are and what they want to become?
Ian, do you want to go first?
Sure. I've got something here. It's always within reach for me. I have this book called The Fisk Guide to Colleges. Purvey, I'm sure you've heard of this one as well. It's very thick. It's got about 350 schools in it. And it's a great way to learn a little bit more about different kinds of institutions that you can't necessarily visit. And I'll share one recommendation that I have for students when they're using a college guidebook like that one, and then also limited in terms of where they can actually go and visit. If you just put your home as a center point and then create a radius and draw a big circle around it of how far you're willing to drive, let's say an hour, there will be colleges within that circle. And I think every college visit can be of value to you as you're exploring the possibilities out there for you, right? So for me, I live in Portland and I could go see Reed College, Portland State, Lewis and Clark, Willamette University. If I want to go up north, I could see some schools in Seattle, like the University of Washington, Oregon, Oregon State, right? There's an embarrassment of riches and a wide range of different school types that are available there. And so what I recommend students do is before you visit, read about the school in a guidebook, and then go and visit campus and see to what extent your impressions of the school through the reading hold up with your campus visit. It's very similar to a scientist creating a hypothesis and then testing that hypothesis with the evidence that they gather. And so if you learn that your reading holds up really, really well with what you're experiencing on campus, then you can trust your research for schools that you aren't able to visit, that might be on the other side of the country. And that can become a really important piece of your process. If there's a gap in terms of what you're reading and what you're experiencing on campus, you can start to isolate those factors that are contributing to that gap and then see how you can plug in those holes. You might email current students. You might ask an admission officer some questions through an email that you send to them. Maybe you're using more of the school website. But the idea is figure out how you research and to what extent that can support you with a few case studies, and then expand it more broadly to a wider set of schools. And it's always great to go and visit colleges before you actually enroll or before you sign an early decision agreement. You definitely want to do that. But I think there are too many schools to see them all before you send in an application. So this is a great way to find that middle ground and still benefit from some visits while also understanding that circumstances might prevent you from seeing everything.
I'll just add a touch. We also love the FIS guide. We don't give out the book. We actually have it uploaded in our portal for our students to read, but we really encourage it. I also, colleges did a great job transitioning to virtual events during COVID, like a really fantastic job. Mm-hmm. So the events that are offered online are significantly better than what were offered pre-COVID for students. So the events are more insightful. They are, more well-developed. And so students actually can learn quite a bit about colleges now through the virtual events if they're not able to visit, or if they live in an area where maybe that 1 hour circle doesn't necessarily give them several schools to visit. But I also recommend looking at a diversity of schools, visiting a diversity of schools. They may not be schools that you actually end up applying to, but you visit a big public school, you visit a small liberal arts college, you visit one that's going to be more suburban, maybe one that's in the middle of the city, and whatever range that you might be looking for. And that's going to give you a sense of what are you actually looking for. It'll help you articulate what your interests are, and they can be varied. You might be very happy at a big school and a small school, and that's okay. But there will be other criteria that will start to bubble up to the top as being more important for you. If you start to look at impacted majors, so if we're talking about like engineering, computer science, biology, psychology, or business, really looking at the programs in depth and how they're different among colleges. The most common thing I hear from kids when they start researching colleges, they all look the same. I'm like, they're actually all very different. How are you researching them? And they go, well, I just looked to see if they had a business program. I'm like, no. We have to think about this differently. Like, how flexible are they? What kinds of courses will you be able to take? What kinds of projects are students working on? What kinds of internships or jobs are students getting after the fact? Like, really diving into it. And one of the things, talk to your friends who are in college. Maybe you have older siblings who have friends in colleges, cousins, just to get a sense of what do they like and dislike about their own experiences. It will help you to be thoughtful about what you're looking for. And the last thing I will say is that college, yes, you're going for an academic experience, but you're going to be living there for 4 years. So you really want to think about it very holistically. What are the other things you're going to be able to get involved in on campus beyond, I'm going to get a degree and graduate? Like, you're going to potentially develop lifelong relationships and friendships. You're going to potentially connect with people that you're going to be working with in the future. You're going to get access to opportunities, and you're going to have fun, I hope, on campus. And so really think about it very broadly.
Thanks so much for this great advice. It actually is related to a question that was in the Q&A. We actually had a student do research on the positive impact of physically visiting college campuses prior to enrolling. And I think a lot of the advice that you've given really relates to those kinds of benefits. Just as a personal anecdote, I was telling Purvi before the panel began, I grew up in rural Maine, and so I knew from the beginning that I did not want to go to a big school in a big city. I really wanted to be out in nature, to be exploring, to be on a smaller campus. And so I found myself at Middlebury College, very much like Reed College, with people that are thinking sort of creatively, interested in the environment, going out and playing ultimate frisbee all the time. So knowing that these are the kinds of things that would make me comfortable on campus, I think was a big driving inspiration to steer me towards those smaller, more rural kinds of schools. We have some minutes left. In the remaining time, I would love to also think a little bit more specifically about things like research projects and how students can show that they're really interested in something, but also that they have a sort of problem-solving quality about themselves, that they're willing to not just read through a biology textbook and then perform well in an exam. They're interested in digging deeper and asking questions. How do you get students into that mindset? This is something that we think a lot about doing too, to, I appreciated your comparison with visiting colleges and comparing against expectations as a kind of scientific method of discovery. Yes. How do you get students into this mindset? What sort of advice would you give to them to say, this is how you should take on a research project or frame it so that it can help to tell a clear story?
Ian, do you want to jump in or shall I?
Yeah, I can jump in. And it's a great question because it really is about how students create a mindset around this process that both allows them to demonstrate that mindset, but also really capitalize on the opportunity to make use of the application in the way that it does. I think one of the hard things to, first of all, just acknowledge is that the application itself is pretty limited in terms of the amount of space that you have to describe yourself and tell that story. And so there is an analytical aspect in some respects of saying, here are the different components of the application. How am I going to use each of them to think about the different ways that I can contribute to a college community? One of the things that I think is just really important that seems counterintuitive is that students need to apply to fewer colleges. I think that they need to have, we would say about 7 to 10 colleges on their list, not 15, not 20, not 25. And the idea is that students will say, well, how do I know where I want to apply? That's where that research comes into the process, where you can really say, here are the schools that I'm really excited by and interested in. I think where students will struggle is if they're applying to 15 schools, they have to treat their essays more like tasks to be completed as opposed to questions with which they can engage, right? So if I'm looking at an essay question and I think I have 15 of these to write and I have 3 weeks to do it, I'm going to treat it more like, all right, I'm just answering the question, I'm moving on to the next one. But colleges ask questions in their supplemental essays that are intended to reflect the spirit of the institution and the fit that students can show in those spaces. And so the more you can read a prompt and really engage with the ideas behind that prompt, the more that you can think critically about how you might bring different understandings of that institution and yourself into that response. It's almost like a Venn diagram where you've got yourself and the school, and you want that answer to live at the intersection of yourself and that institution. That is driven by research, that is driven by an understanding of self, and that's driven by a real curiosity about how to answer that question. And I think everyone can do it, whether you're a great writer, whether you're great in as a humanist, or even if you're a scientist. You might have a slightly different approach towards compiling the information that you want to put into that response, but you really can be thoughtful about how you're going to marry those ideas of yourself in that school. So for me, I think it starts with limit the schools that you apply to, be real smart about your list, and then engage thoughtfully with how you respond to different questions a school provides for you so that you are showing them that you're a fit for their institution. And there's a lot more to talk about, but I bet Purvi's going to cover some of that.
I'm actually going to answer your question a little bit differently. I'm going to talk about like the research, like doing research and diving into intellectual curiosities, if that's okay. So one of the things that we really like to do in our office is we pay attention to our kids, right? And I'm sure that you do the same thing, and really pick up on where they start to show little inflections of interest, and they might not actually know that this is of significance. So, I'll give an example. I had a student who we were just talking and we were talking about his chemistry class, and he said, yeah, like it's really interesting about like Western medicine is so based on drugs and chemical drugs that we use to solve health. Whereas at home, my parents really talk about Ayurvedic medicine. And so I was like, oh, that's really interesting. Like, talk to me more about that. And so as we were talking, I was like, that sounds like a research project for you. And he's like, what do you mean? I'm like, you can compare Ayurvedic medicine to Western medicine and how different approaches are used to solve the same ailments. And he's like, that's really interesting. So he went home, he started doing a little bit more research, and he's digging in. And then he's like, do you know there's a lot of research out there that shows how Ayurvedic medicines are actually, because they're homeopathic, are actually have fewer side effects? I'm like, that's great. You probably need to write about that and do deeper research into that. And so he just dug in and he wrote this incredible self-driven paper. And this was years before Polygens was in existence. And had it been, he definitely would have done a Polygens project about this. Another student loves English, is currently an English major now at Stanford. And she and I were just talking about, like, what does she love about English? And she's like, I really love this idea of how humor has evolved. And I was like, tell me more about that. And she's like, the evolution of humor, the way we think about it when Shakespeare, when we look at Shakespeare's, they're comedies, but are they really comedies? They're very, there's tragic components, and how Mark Twain has infused humor differently and how we think about humor now. She wrote this really cool research paper about the evolution of humor. And so a lot of it is just really figuring out there are these inflection points. And my last example would be, I had a student who carried a little notebook, a little black notebook. He had a phone, but he carried this notebook, and he would walk around, and when he saw something interesting, he'd write it down, because otherwise he'd get home and like completely forget everything. So he'd write things down. And then one day he saw kids playing rock, paper, scissors. So he wrote it down, and he came down and he came home and looked at his notebook between homework assignments. He's like, oh, I want to learn more about that. Starts learning about game theory, chaos theory. He figures out there are like these massive rock, paper, scissors conferences, if you guys can actually believe that. And did, again, like a really cool deep dive in research topic. And so these were ideas that were just little sparks for these students. And by being able to dive deeply into them, admittedly, a lot of these ideas did show up in their college applications. And I do think that, there are schools that will ask, tell us about your intellectual curiosities. I was just, talking to GP earlier about one of somebody I know that interviews for Penn. One of the questions that he likes to ask students is, how do you learn? Not tell me about your greatest activity. How do you learn? Which I'm like, that's a very difficult, amazing question. And so now we do our mock interviews. I always ask that question, but it really goes into this kid with the notebook, he would have had an amazing answer for that. Any of these kids would have had that. So it's, these qualities definitely translate. I think kids sometimes feel like they don't have time to go into these deep topics, because they feel like I have to go to my 17 different practices, and I have this and I have that, and all of those things are really important in my application. I'm like, it's not about quantity, it's about quality. It's about having deep experiences, being able to be introspective about those experiences, be thoughtful about those. Those are going to serve you incredibly well when you're answering all of those really amazing essay questions on your college application. So really, it's just time the last thing, mentoring. And so, there are topics I'm able to help my students with. There are topics that kids come to, I'm like, that's really amazing, but I don't understand the intricacies of it. You want to find a mentor that can actually guide you through this intelligently, intellectually, and understand the problems as you see them and help you solve them. And so that's a really cool thing, is finding mentors in your life. You're going to always want to have mentors in your life. I still look for mentors in my life, and that's going to serve you well now to be able to solve these questions, dive deeply, but also later in your life when you're in college and you're wanting a research project with a professor, when you are at your job and you're wanting to, learn how to navigate whatever corporation or industry you're in. Finding mentors is incredibly valuable.
Agreed.
Wow, thank you both so much for that answer. As we sort of reach the end of time, I'm just reminded of how much wonderful experience and how much care you both give to the students that you're working with. I know that we have a couple of other questions in the Q&A. And Purvi, one of them is sort of related to something that Ian mentioned. I was wondering if we could get maybe a short answer to how many schools you recommend students apply to. Ian said 7 to 10 is a good number to shoot for, which is maybe against the grain of trends that we've seen recently where students apply to 15 or 20. What do you encourage students to aim for in those application numbers?
Yeah, it really varies, to be honest with you. I'm not a big fan of massive lists of colleges because I think it does end up, you can submit too many mediocre applications and that's not going to help you anywhere. But to me, it's more about balance, finding that right balance of schools. And so, we have a 7-point scale of difficulty. And I say, like, I want you to have schools that are maybe not across all 7, but I want you to have those most difficult schools that you're applying to and the ones that are definitely targets and safeties, but ones that you love. So sometimes kids will come to me like, I'm going to apply to this school as a safety because it's easy. I'm like, but will you actually go there? I'm like, no. I'm like, then it's not actually a good safety for you. So to me, it's more about balance. It depends on major, because kids who are applying for really impacted majors, I might recommend a few more schools. And it depends on the strength of a student's application. So for my really strong applicants that want to apply to the most competitive schools in the country, it actually gets a little bit trickier. I might recommend they apply to a couple of more schools because now we're looking at schools that have 3, 4, 5% acceptance rates where they might be a really strong candidate. They might not get into a few of these schools, but they may get into 1 or 2 of these other schools. So I don't really have a set number in mind. It really, will vary based on so many different factors. But again, I strong advocate for not massive lists. Do the hard work now in building out your college list. It makes choosing college and where you're going to go so much easier.
Great. That's great advice. We have one quick question. And then I actually want to leave with a question for both of you, a more fun and sort of exploratory question. We have a student who is wondering about virtual tours and if they, do they have the same effect of demonstrated interest as in-person tours given the times that we're in? Do you have any signal from colleges about, that demonstrated interest vis-a-vis virtual tours?
Yeah, I think with respect to demonstrated interest, it's important first, don't assume that schools take demonstrated interest even into account. The more selective institutions, the larger universities will not. It tends to be smaller schools like Reed and Middlebury that are interested in whether you express that interest through a visit or through a contact or talking to someone at a college fair. So you can usually find information about whether demonstrated interest matters, first of all. If it does, virtual tours are going to also demonstrate interest to a school because you're taking the time to go and learn more about it. The key is that you have to register, right? So they have to know your name and your email address and your high school, which they'll typically ask you as you register. And then they can say, oh yeah, Ian Fisher was interested in us because he came to this virtual visit back in March.
And just adding in, everything Ian said is correct. The only other thing I'll say, people start to think of these as things you have to check off on a box. Like, oh, I must attend a virtual tour. And so they sign up. Colleges will also track how long you attend the virtual session, by the way. So it's not just like, oh, I signed up and I attended for the first 5 minutes. And don't think of it as just checking it off for demonstrated interest. Use this as an opportunity to learn about the school.
That's great. Okay, one quick question. I would love sort of spontaneous responses. Don't overthink it. If you had to do a Polygens project yourselves today, or maybe even as a student back in high school, what do you think it would have been? I'll give you my example. I grew up, as I say, in Maine, doing a lot of skiing. I would have loved to have been with a mechanical engineer, and I was a humanities major, so this is not at all my wheelhouse, but I would have loved to have been with like a mechanical engineer to help me design a pair of skis and maybe build one out myself. That's sort of what I would go back to. How about you two?
That's cool. I'm thinking of immediately what comes to mind is my senior thesis at Reed, which I already explored, which was about the ethical implications of creating life from scratch. So it was a philosophy of biology thesis, very much like a year-long Polygens program. And then when I was at Stanford in graduate school, I did my final project on exploring different attitudes that different countries have towards teaching as a profession and the challenge of professionalizing teaching. I think that's the area that, my current interests are drifting more towards understanding better, really unpacking, especially teaching. Why don't we pay teachers more? Why don't we hold it in a greater prestige? It's such an important role. Mentoring is happening at every level all the way through grade school, and teachers are a key aspect of that. So I think that's a space where I'd want to dive in, but it's also, there's a lot of research being done in that space. So it's a little bit crowded, I know.
I love this question. I feel like I could come up with like 30 different questions if you asked me at a different time of the day. So I think that if I were in high school, I really would have wanted to do something around psychology. I did end up becoming a psychology major, didn't know that I'd want to be a psychology major, but child development is actually quite fascinating to me, cognitive child development. And I think I would want to, at that point, I probably would have wanted to do something around how children learn and really understand how children learn differently. And now, again, there's so much research, and now I know a lot of that research, but I didn't know it then. As an adult, I've become actually really fascinated with world religions and trying to understand it. Again, there's already a lot of research that's out there, but really diving a little bit more deeply into how world religions have started to splinter off, and at what point did we go wrong, where they could have potentially have worked well, beautifully together versus actually being in conflict. And so that was a much deeper project. And I know people are diving into it and they spend their whole life studying it, but it's just something I've become more interested in recently.
So fascinating. I'm actually grateful to learn a little bit more about your interests as well. That was part of my my reason for asking the question. We have one final quick question from a student. And it's really about, what do I do if I can't commit to a big research project or I don't have a lot of resources? What do you suggest I do to explore my interests in that sort of introductory way when you can't commit to something bigger?
Yeah. This for me reminds me a little bit of what Purvi was saying about, just taking notes, that student that you have that has the black notebook, and thinking about sparks, right? So most sparks don't become full flames, right? And the ones that actually become roaring fires, pretty rare, right? But you still engage with each one of those sparks and see where that opportunity might take you. So I think that, don't think about it as, I've got to find the big research project that I'm going to do, right? It starts with, what are the questions I'm interested in and how am I going to explore them? And some of those sparks might fizzle out, and some might be small flames, and some might turn into a roaring fire, but you don't know when you're first starting. So I think it's just a matter of continuing to ask questions, reading as much as you can, read, read articles online, read books, go to the library. And that can help to touch you off on this sense of curiosity. But I would be very surprised, Purvi, if the students that you mentioned there came into your office and were like, here's the project I'm going to work on. I've got the whole idea schemed out. It's very much like, I like humor and I like writing. So what do you think about this? Right. So I think, don't put pressure on yourself as a student to come up with a fully fledged research project from the get-go. It really takes time to develop it.
Yeah. And I would just say, adding on to what Ian said, libraries are free. The internet has so much information, filter through it. But there's so much information out there. Talk to your teachers, who would probably be very excited to talk to you about any of the things you're really interested in. Don't be afraid to ask questions, email people. You would be shocked how many adults will respond to high school students saying, I'm interested in this topic. You've worked on this topic. They may or may not respond, but somebody might respond and give you a little bit of feedback. Journals and articles are so readily available online these days. It's not one of these things where you have to have an expensive subscription. There's so much information out there. And not everything is going to turn into a full-fledged research project, right? It could be for this one kid with the chaos theory and game theory and rock, paper, scissors, it did for him. And the examples that I gave, but there are other kids that are just I learned about this topic. I read about it. It was so cool. I'm on to my next topic. So it's really about developing a sense of curiosity, and not allowing that curiosity, that skill that you have, that innate trait that you have, to really kind of die out. So read, 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 read. Not read college, but read READ.
Ian will take that plug, I'm sure.
I'll take it.
However,
yeah.
Take it anyway.
Yep.
Listen, you two, Ian and Purvi, thank you so much for all of your time and expertise, especially on a Saturday. I know that our students and their parents really appreciate your insight here. Thanks also for engaging in these thought experiments that I've asked of you. And If any students are looking for great counselors to work with, Ian Fisher of Bright Horizons College Coach and Purvi Modi of Insight Education, I'm sure would be happy to speak with you all. So please feel free to reach out to them or to us directly and we can put you in touch. Thanks to everyone who's going to continue. I know we've went long. Thanks for staying. Grab a drink of water and then head to the next sessions. Bye.
Thank you.